Marcus Chen's hand froze on the shed door handle, his breath catching in his throat as the smell hit him first, sharp, metallic, unmistakable. The rusty hinges groaned as he pulled the door open wider, and the afternoon sunlight spilled across a scene that would be seared into his memory forever. Blood. Everywhere. Dark crimson streaks painted across the weathered wooden floorboards in violent patterns that told a story of suffering and struggle. His eyes darted frantically across the interior of the shed, unable to process what he was seeing at first, his mind refusing to accept the reality that was unfolding before him. The bodies were small, impossibly delicate, their soft gray fur matted with blood and dirt. Marcus felt his stomach lurch as he took a hesitant step forward, his work boots creaking against the floorboards. The industrial-strength rat traps were scattered throughout the space, along the walls, near the corner where he kept his gardening tools, even on the workbench where he'd been restoring an old chair just days ago. Each trap held its victim in a brutal metal embrace, the spring-loaded bars having done their terrible work with efficient, unforgiving force. His hands began to tremble as he knelt down beside the nearest trap, his knees pressing into the cold floor. The northern flying squirrel caught in the device was barely recognizable, its tiny skull crushed, those distinctive large black eyes now dulled and lifeless. Marcus had spent hours watching these creatures glide between the old oak trees on his property, their patagium, the membrane stretching from wrist to ankle, catching the moonlight as they sailed through the darkness with impossible grace. They were beautiful, rare, and entirely harmless. And now they were dead. He forced himself to count them, his voice barely a whisper as he moved from one trap to the next. 1, 2, 3. Each number felt like a stone dropping into the pit of his stomach. 4, 5, 6. His throat tightened, making it difficult to breathe. 7. 7 protected northern flying squirrels, each one a violation of federal law, each one a creature that had been thriving on his property until someone had decided to play God. Marcus stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him, and that's when he heard it. The slow, deliberate sound of hands clapping together. The sound cut through the rushing in his ears, sharp and mocking, dragging his attention away from the carnage inside the shed. He turned, his jaw clenched so tight that his teeth ached, and saw the source of his torment standing at the edge of his driveway. Kenneth Rothman looked exactly as he always did, immaculate, composed, radiating the kind of smug confidence that came from never having faced real consequences for anything in his entire privileged life. His sandy blonde hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place despite the afternoon breeze that rustled through the neighborhood. The HOA president wore a crisp salmon-colored polo shirt tucked into pressed khaki pants, his leather belt matching his expensive loafers. Everything about Kenneth screamed calculated perfection, from the designer watch on his wrist to the way he stood with his weight shifted slightly to one side, as if posing for an invisible camera. That smile, that insufferable, self-satisfied smile, stretched across Kenneth's tanned face as he slowly lowered his hands from his mocking applause. His blue eyes gleamed with barely contained delight, the kind of expression someone wore when they believed they'd just pulled off the perfect prank. He took a few casual steps closer, his movements unhurried, savoring the moment like a fine wine. "Looks like you've got a pest problem, Marcus," Kenneth called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. The tone was light, conversational, dripping with false concern that didn't quite mask the underlying satisfaction. "I took the liberty of helping you out. Can't have vermin ruining our pristine neighborhood, now can we?" Marcus felt something cold and sharp crystallize in his chest, not the hot, explosive anger he might have expected, but something far more dangerous. It was as if his entire body temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant, his vision sharpening, his mind suddenly cutting through the fog of shock and horror with laser-like precision. He stood there in the doorway of his shed, blood-spattered floor behind him, and stared at the man who had just confessed to mass slaughter with all the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. Marcus would learn the full extent of Kenneth's planning only later, when the investigation uncovered the digital trail of his neighbor's research. Kenneth had spent hours online searching for how to deal with squirrel infestations, convincing himself through selective reading and willful ignorance that the protected northern flying squirrels on Marcus's property were nothing more than common pests. He had never bothered to actually identify the species before launching his attack, never paused to consider that his assumptions might be dangerously wrong. His mind had been made up before he ever looked at the animals themselves. They were on Marcus's property, and therefore they had to be eliminated. The execution of Kenneth's plan had been methodical and deliberate. He had risen before dawn on that fateful morning, armed with 24 industrial traps from Bradley's hardware store, their steel jaws gleaming in the dim light of early morning. Moving with the furtive urgency of a man who knew he was crossing lines, Kenneth had systematically placed the traps throughout Marcus's shed, along the fence line where the squirrels often traveled, and near the hollow oak tree where the colony had established their primary nest. Each trap was positioned with careful thought, designed to maximize the damage and suffering. The receipt from Bradley's hardware would later prove crucial in the investigation. Kenneth had used his personal credit card, creating an undeniable paper trail that connected him directly to the purchase of the specific trap models found scattered across Marcus's property. For a man who prided himself on his business acumen, it was a remarkably careless mistake. But Kenneth's biggest error wasn't just the illegal traps themselves, it was his pathological need to gloat about his victory. After that initial confrontation in Marcus's driveway, where he had stood with his arms crossed and that infuriating smirk on his face, Kenneth found himself unable to contain his satisfaction. The very next evening, he gathered with his cronies at the Pinewood Springs Country Club, settling into the leather chairs of the members' lounge with a glass of expensive scotch in hand. Doug Patterson and Victor Hollings listened as Kenneth regaled them with tales of how he had finally found a way to make Marcus suffer, and how he had taught that troublemaker a lesson about who runs this neighborhood. His voice carried across the quiet room, filled with the pride of a man who believed himself untouchable. Doug, who possessed slightly more common sense than Kenneth despite years of enabling his behavior, had apparently felt a flicker of concern. He leaned forward in his chair, his expression uncertain. "Those squirrels Marcus has been going on about, they're not protected, are they?" he asked, his voice low enough that the other club members wouldn't overhear. Kenneth had laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. He took a long sip of his drink before responding, his eyes glittering with malice. "Who cares?" he said, waving his hand dismissively. "By the time anyone figures it out, the evidence will be gone, and it'll be Marcus's word against mine. You think anyone's going to take his side over mine? I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years. I'm president of the HOA. Marcus is just some newcomer who doesn't know his place." What Kenneth didn't know, couldn't have known in his bubble of arrogance, was that his confession was already beginning to gnaw at Doug's conscience. For months, Doug had watched Kenneth's escalating behavior with growing unease, telling himself that he was just being supportive, that Kenneth's actions were justified by Marcus's supposed troublemaking. But this was different. This was a crime, spoken about with casual indifference in a room full of witnesses. The words would echo in Doug's mind for days afterward, keeping him awake at night until his conscience finally won the battle against his loyalty. That confession would be the final straw that transformed Doug Patterson from reluctant accomplice to crucial witness for the prosecution. The traps had already done their terrible work. 7 northern flying squirrels lay dead by the time Marcus discovered the extent of Kenneth's attack, their small bodies broken and lifeless. 3 more had been injured, dragging themselves away from the steel jaws with broken limbs and torn flesh. Marcus had spent hours that first day carefully removing each trap, documenting their positions with photographs, his heart breaking with each discovery. The hollow oak tree, once filled with the soft chittering of the squirrel colony, had fallen silent. The air itself seemed to mourn. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up as he unlocked it with his thumbprint. His fingers were steady now, completely steady, as he opened the camera application. He turned back to the shed, framing the first shot carefully. The blood-streaked floor, the scattered traps, the small broken bodies that had been living creatures just hours ago. The camera shutter clicked softly, recording everything in high resolution, capturing details that would be admissible in court, undeniable in their brutal clarity. Marcus moved through the shed systematically, photographing each trap from multiple angles, making sure the timestamps were clearly embedded in the metadata. He documented the forced entry marks on the shed door that he hadn't noticed before, scratches around the lock where Kenneth had used some kind of tool to gain access. He photographed the placement of the traps, their deliberate distribution throughout the space showing clear intent and premeditation rather than any accidental or defensive placement. When he had documented everything inside, he stepped back out into the afternoon sunlight and photographed the exterior approach to the shed, the sightlines from the street, the lack of any "no trespassing" signs that Kenneth might later claim he hadn't seen. He photographed the neighboring properties, establishing the context and location. Every image was another nail, another piece of irrefutable evidence. Finally, Marcus turned his phone toward Kenneth's house across the street. Through his zoom lens, he could see the HOA president standing in his front window, still visible, still watching Marcus's property with that same self-satisfied expression. Marcus took the photo, capturing Kenneth's face clearly, documenting that the man was still in the immediate vicinity, still monitoring the results of his handiwork. Marcus lowered the phone and stood there for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Kenneth's house. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the pristine lawns and perfect flower beds of Pinewood Springs. Children played in yards down the street, their laughter carrying on the breeze. A neighbor walked a golden retriever past Marcus's property, waving cheerfully, oblivious to what had just transpired. Everything looked normal, peaceful, suburban, safe. But Marcus knew better now. He understood that beneath the veneer of community and order, there were people like Kenneth Rothman who believed that power, no matter how petty, how small, how insignificant, gave them the right to destroy whatever they pleased without consequence. But Kenneth had made a critical miscalculation. He had assumed that Marcus was powerless, that the months of harassment had broken something essential inside him, that one more violation would simply be absorbed like all the others. Kenneth had seen Marcus as a victim, as someone who would clean up the mess, dispose of the evidence, and accept this latest cruelty as just another inevitable defeat in a war he couldn't win. Kenneth Rothman had no idea who he was really dealing with. He didn't know about Marcus's background in environmental law, about the years he'd spent working with conservation organizations before moving to Pinewood Springs for a quieter life. He didn't know about the network of contacts Marcus still maintained, the lawyers and wildlife officials and activists who would jump at the chance to prosecute a case this clear-cut, this egregious, this perfectly documented. Most importantly, Kenneth didn't know that his moment of triumph, that smug smile, that mocking applause, that casual confession, had just sealed his fate more completely than any trap he'd set in Marcus's shed. Marcus slipped his phone back into his pocket, his mind already organizing the next steps, planning the sequence of calls he needed to make, the evidence he needed to preserve, the authorities he needed to contact. But first, he had one more thing to do. He turned back to look at Kenneth's house one final time, seeing the silhouette still standing in the window, still watching, still completely unaware that his entire world was about to come crashing down around him. But Marcus couldn't let it go. Each violation felt like a personal attack because that's exactly what it was. Kenneth didn't just fine him, he showed up at Marcus's property unannounced, claiming inspection rights that didn't actually exist in the bylaws. He peered through windows, photographed Marcus's vegetable garden from the sidewalk, and even flew a drone over the property until Marcus threatened to involve the police. The bird feeders in Marcus's backyard trees became another battleground, with Kenneth insisting they attracted nuisance wildlife, despite identical feeders hanging in yards throughout the neighborhood. The campaign went beyond Marcus himself. Kenneth poisoned relationships, spreading concerns to neighbors who had once been friendly. Mr. Pemberton, the elderly widower next door who used to bring over homemade cookies and share gardening tips, suddenly stopped making eye contact. Marcus later learned that Kenneth had convinced him the vegetable garden was somehow lowering property values, despite no evidence beyond Kenneth's authoritative assertions. "You have to understand," Mr. Pemberton said one afternoon when Marcus finally cornered him, his voice apologetic but firm. "Kenneth knows about these things. He's been president for 7 years. He says property values are down 3% because of non-conforming landscaping." "My garden is beautiful and completely within regulations," Marcus protested. "Kenneth is manipulating you." But Mr. Pemberton just shook his head and hurried inside, another casualty of Kenneth's systematic isolation campaign. Marcus felt the loneliness settling over him like fog. The neighborhood that had once seemed welcoming now turned cold and suspicious. The breaking point came during what Kenneth called an emergency session to consider new security measures. He proposed a bylaw requiring all residents to seek HOA approval before having overnight guests, ostensibly to maintain security standards, but obviously designed to exert even more control over people's private lives. The proposal was so absurd, so clearly overreaching that Marcus couldn't stay silent. He stood, his chair scraping loudly in the hushed community center. Every eye turned toward him, some sympathetic, others nervous, all waiting to see if anyone would finally challenge Kenneth's overreach. "This is ridiculous," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "You're not proposing security measures, Kenneth. You're proposing surveillance. You want approval rights over who we invite into our own homes? That's not community standards, that's a dictator's fantasy." The room erupted. Some homeowners applauded while others gasped at the direct confrontation. Kenneth's face flushed deep red, his knuckles white as he gripped the table edge. Doug and Victor stammered objections, but the damage was done. The spell of Kenneth's authority cracked, and the proposal failed in a rare display of collective backbone. Marcus thought he'd won something that night. He was wrong. Kenneth waited for him in the parking lot afterward, stepping from the shadows near Marcus's car. The streetlight cast his face in harsh angles, his expression twisted with barely controlled rage. He moved close, too close, pointing his finger inches from Marcus's face with such aggression that Marcus instinctively stepped back against his car door. "You're going to learn respect for authority, Marcus," Kenneth said, his voice low and venomous, nothing like the syrupy politeness he used in meetings. Spit flecked his lips as he spoke, his finger jabbing the air between them like a blade. "I've broken stronger men than you." The rat trap incident wasn't just cruel, it was catastrophically illegal, and Kenneth's arrogance had blinded him to the magnitude of his mistake. Marcus stood in his backyard that morning, staring at the carnage before him, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. What Kenneth had dismissed as a clever intimidation tactic was actually a violation of the Federal Wildlife Protection Act, the State Endangered Species Preservation Law, and the Criminal Trespass Statute, all rolled into one spectacularly stupid decision. The morning sun cast long shadows across the property, illuminating the gruesome evidence of Kenneth's crime with merciless clarity. Kenneth Rothman hadn't always been insufferable, or so the old-timers in Pinewood Springs claimed, though Marcus found that increasingly difficult to believe. The man who stood before him now, clipboard clutched like a weapon and eyes gleaming with bureaucratic fervor, seemed born for tyranny. 7 years Kenneth had ruled the Homeowners Association, transforming what should have been a simple community organization into his personal kingdom, complete with a rulebook that had swelled to 300 pages of increasingly absurd regulations. Each monthly amendment targeted whoever had most recently dared to challenge his authority, and Marcus had long since become the primary focus of Kenneth's legislative creativity. The first encounter had been almost comical. Marcus remembered moving into the quiet neighborhood 2 years ago, filled with hope for a fresh start and peaceful suburban life. Within a week, Kenneth appeared at his door, silver luxury sedan gleaming in the driveway, clipboard already in hand. He was a man of average height but carried himself with the inflated importance of someone who had finally found a stage small enough to dominate completely. His hair was meticulously combed, his polo shirt pressed with military precision, and his smile held all the warmth of a January frost. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Kenneth had said, though his eyes were already scanning Marcus's property for violations. "I'm Kenneth Rothman, HOA president. Just wanted to introduce myself and remind you that we maintain very high standards here. I've taken the liberty of documenting a few items that will need immediate attention." Marcus had laughed then, assuming it was some kind of neighborly hazing. The laugh died when Kenneth handed him a typed list of 17 violations, ranging from his mailbox being 2 inches too far from the curb to the unauthorized placement of a welcome mat that exceeded regulation dimensions. That welcome mat cost Marcus $50 in fines, the first of many financial penalties that would flow from Kenneth's pen like water from a broken dam. The harassment escalated with mathematical precision. Kenneth began his patrols at dawn, circling the block in his sedan like a shark scenting blood. His clipboard never rested. Marcus's grass, which he measured religiously every weekend, was allegedly 3/4 of an inch too tall. $50. His garage door, freshly painted in what the hardware store assured him was HOA-approved beige, was deemed desert sand instead of Sahara tan. $100. The paint chips were virtually identical, requiring a magnifying glass and considerable imagination to distinguish, but Kenneth's imagination was well developed when it came to finding fault. "You understand, this is about maintaining property values," Kenneth explained during one of his uninvited inspections, photographing Marcus's backyard from multiple angles. "One person's negligence affects us all. I'm sure you want to be a good neighbor, Marcus." The way he said the name, with just enough emphasis to make it sound like an accusation, made Marcus's jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level, refusing to give Kenneth the satisfaction of an outburst. "My property is immaculate, Kenneth. Everyone can see that." "Everyone sees what I document," Kenneth replied, his smile widening. "And I document everything." The HOA meetings became theatrical performances of Kenneth's power. He sat at the head of the community center table in a leather chair noticeably larger than the others, flanked by his loyal board members Doug Patterson and Victor Hollings. The two men functioned as Kenneth's personal chorus, nodding enthusiastically at his pronouncements and voting in lockstep with every proposal. Marcus attended religiously, at first attempting reason, and then, as frustration mounted, increasingly pointed challenges to Kenneth's authority. "This fine is completely arbitrary," Marcus said at one meeting, holding up a violation notice for trash bins placed at the curb 15 minutes before the designated window. 15 minutes. I was following the spirit of the rule, and you know it." Kenneth leaned back in his throne, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. His voice dripped with condescension, each word carefully measured for maximum patronization. "Marcus, the rules exist for everyone's benefit. If we let one person slide, the entire neighborhood descends into chaos. Surely you understand that. We can't have different standards for different people. That would be unfair to everyone who follows the regulations properly." Doug and Victor nodded sagely, as if Kenneth had just delivered the Gettysburg Address. Around the table, other homeowners shifted uncomfortably, some sympathetic to Marcus but unwilling to paint targets on their own backs. Kenneth's retribution was swift and thorough, and most had learned to keep their heads down and their properties in perfect compliance. Kenneth had no idea, absolutely no idea, what he had just done. The northern flying squirrel wasn't some common pest. some nuisance species that could be dealt with using hardware store traps and suburban vigilante justice. They were protected under the Endangered Wildlife Protection Act, a federal statute that carried penalties serious enough to make even career criminals think twice. And Kenneth had just killed 7 of them, deliberately, methodically, on property that wasn't even his own. Marcus's mind raced backward through the past 3 months, through all those early morning meetings with Dr. Sarah Winters from the State Wildlife Commission. He could see her clearly in his memory, clipboard in hand, camera around her neck, her enthusiasm barely contained as she documented the thriving colony of flying squirrels that had made Marcus's 5-acre property their home. "This is incredible, Mr. Chen," she had told him, her eyes bright with professional excitement. "We've been trying to establish viable populations in this region for years. Your property might be the key to the entire conservation effort." They had set up monitoring stations together, installed nest boxes in the old oaks, documented feeding patterns and breeding behavior. Marcus had the paperwork, all of it: permits, documentation, photographic evidence, email correspondence with state and federal wildlife authorities. Everything was meticulously recorded, legally binding, and completely damning to anyone who had interfered with the protected species on his property. And Kenneth Rothman had just walked right into that legal trap without even knowing it existed. Marcus watched as Kenneth turned away, clearly satisfied with his little display of dominance, and began walking back toward his own property. The HOA president's house stood across the street, a 2-story colonial with white columns that were just a bit too grand for the neighborhood, a lawn that was just a bit too perfect, hedges trimmed with geometric precision that somehow managed to look aggressive rather than appealing. Everything about Kenneth's property screamed control, domination, the desperate need to impose order on the natural world and on everyone around him. For the past 2 years, ever since Kenneth had been elected president of the Pinewood Springs Homeowners Association, he had made Marcus's life a calculated exercise in bureaucratic torture. Violation notices for grass that was supposedly too long, despite Marcus measuring it himself and finding it well within regulations. Fines for exterior paint colors that allegedly didn't match the approved palette, even though Marcus had used the exact shade specified in the covenant documents. Threatening letters about the unsightly vegetable garden in the backyard, demands that Marcus remove the bird feeders that were attracting pests, complaints about the old pickup truck parked in his driveway being an eyesore to the community. Every single action had been deliberate, personal, and relentless. Kenneth wielded the HOA rules like a weapon, interpreting them in whatever way served his purposes, ignoring the actual regulations when they didn't support his agenda. He had tried to make Marcus give up, to force him to either conform completely to Kenneth's vision of suburban perfection or sell the property and leave. But this was different. This wasn't a petty violation or a technical interpretation of arcane HOA bylaws. This was a federal crime, committed on Marcus's property, with Kenneth's smug confession delivered in broad daylight. Something fundamental shifted inside Marcus as he stood there, watching Kenneth's retreating figure. The trembling in his hands stopped. The sick feeling in his stomach transformed into something harder, colder, more purposeful. His breathing steadied, his shoulders straightened, and his mind began working through the problem with the methodical precision of someone who had finally found solid ground after months of standing on quicksand. Marcus felt his lips move, forming words that were barely audible even to himself, but which carried the weight of absolute certainty. The evening air seemed to still around him as he spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying a promise that would reshape everything in the days to come. "Kenneth," he whispered to himself, watching the figure disappear into the depths of the house across the street. "You have no idea what's coming for you." But Kenneth's arrogance, his absolute certainty in his own invincibility, prevented him from recognizing when to stop. Over the following week, he doubled down on his campaign of harassment, escalating from illegal action to official abuse of power. He drafted a formal HOA violation notice, typing it up on his home computer with meticulous attention to official formatting. The letter claimed that Marcus was maintaining a wildlife nuisance on my property and demanded that he take immediate action to remove all rodents and their habitats, or face a $1,000 fine and potential legal action from the Homeowners Association. Kenneth printed the letter on official HOA letterhead, signing it with a flourish beneath his title as president. He sealed it in an envelope and personally placed it in Marcus's mailbox, feeling the satisfaction of a man who believed he was using the system to crush an enemy. What he had actually done was create a written confession, a document that explicitly proved he knew about the squirrels and actively wanted them removed. The letter would later be entered as Exhibit C in the federal investigation, a piece of evidence so damning that the prosecutors would refer to it as the gift-wrapped confession. Even that wasn't enough to satisfy Kenneth's need for vindication. He decided to escalate further, to bring the weight of official authority down on Marcus's head. He picked up his phone and called the county health department, his voice dripping with false concern as he filed a complaint about disease-carrying vermin infesting the property at Marcus's address. He spoke with practiced sincerity about his worries for neighborhood safety, about the potential health hazards posed by wild animals living in close proximity to residential homes. He hoped, expected really, that the county would send an inspector who would order the immediate removal of the squirrels, giving his own illegal actions a veneer of official sanction after the fact. The inspector who arrived 2 days later was a man named Robert Chen, a career wildlife specialist with 20 years of experience in the county health department. He was in his early 50s, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. He carried a clipboard and wore a county-issued jacket, his expression professionally neutral as Marcus opened the door to greet him. "Mr. Marcus," Chen said, extending his hand for a firm handshake. "I'm Robert Chen from the county health department. We received a complaint about a wildlife issue on your property. Would you mind showing me around?" Marcus had been expecting this call ever since Kenneth's HOA letter arrived. He nodded slowly, gesturing toward the backyard. "Of course, Mr. Chen. I think you'll find this situation is not quite what was reported to you." They walked through the house and out into the yard, where the morning sun was filtering through the trees. Chen's trained eye immediately began scanning the property, taking in the details with practiced efficiency. When they reached the area near the hollow oak tree, Marcus pointed upward, where several of the surviving northern flying squirrels could be seen moving among the branches. Chen froze mid-step, his clipboard lowering slowly as he stared at the animals. His expression shifted from professional detachment to recognition, and then to something harder, more serious. He took several steps closer, tilting his head to get a better angle, confirming what his experience had already told him. "Mr. Marcus," Chen said quietly, his voice careful and measured. "Do you know what species these are?" Marcus met his gaze steadily. "Northern flying squirrels, protected under both federal and state endangered species laws. I've been documenting their presence on my property for the past several months." Chen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked around the property again, this time with different eyes, and Marcus could see the moment when the inspector noticed the disturbed areas where the traps had been placed, the small markers Marcus had left to document each location. "Someone has placed traps here," Chen said. It wasn't a question. 24 industrial rat traps, Marcus confirmed, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "They killed 7 of the squirrels and injured 3 more before I found them. I've removed the traps and preserved them as evidence, along with photographs of their original positions and the animals they killed." Chen pulled out his phone, already beginning to take his own photographs. His expression had changed from concern to grim determination, the look of a man who had just discovered something that would require immediate and serious action. When he finished documenting the scene, he turned to Marcus, his eyes grave. "Mr. Marcus," he said, his voice low and intense, "someone has committed a serious federal crime here, and I'm obligated to report this immediately. Do you have any idea who might have placed these traps? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Marcus had been preparing for this moment ever since he had first discovered Kenneth's handiwork. He had spent days organizing his evidence, arranging it into a comprehensive timeline that left no room for doubt or confusion. He had photographs time-stamped and geotagged, video footage from his security cameras showing Kenneth's pre-dawn visit to the property, printed copies of text messages and emails, and that crucial receipt from Bradley's hardware store that Doug Patterson's guilty conscience had compelled him to provide anonymously. Marcus looked Robert Chen straight in the eye, seeing in the inspector's face the kind of honest dedication to duty that he had hoped to find. This was a man who would follow the evidence wherever it led, regardless of who might be implicated. This was someone who could be trusted with the truth. "I have more than an idea, Mr. Chen," Marcus said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I have photographs, video footage, witness statements, and a credit card receipt. Would you like to see the evidence?" What Kenneth Rothman didn't know about Daniel Crawford could fill a book, but the most important detail he'd overlooked was Daniel's profession. For 23 years, Daniel had worked as a federal investigator with the Department of Environmental Protection, specializing in wildlife crime and illegal trafficking. He had tracked down poachers who smuggled endangered birds across international borders, dismantled networks that trafficked in exotic animal parts, and built cases so airtight that defense attorneys could barely mount a challenge. He had moved to Pinewood Springs hoping for a quiet retirement, imagining peaceful mornings on his porch and afternoons tending his garden, leaving behind the world of criminals and investigations. But Kenneth's harassment had awakened skills Daniel thought he'd left dormant, and once those instincts stirred, there was no putting them back to sleep. From the moment Kenneth started his campaign of intimidation, Daniel had been documenting everything with the thoroughness of someone who understood exactly how cases were built and prosecuted. Every HOA fine arrived in his mailbox like a gift, each one carefully removed from its envelope, photographed from multiple angles, and scanned at high resolution. Every threatening letter, every unauthorized entry onto his property, every verbal confrontation had been cataloged and stored in multiple secure locations, complete with timestamps and GPS coordinates. Daniel maintained 3 separate backup systems, one in a fireproof safe in his basement, one in a secure cloud storage account accessible only through encrypted channels, and one with his attorney in a safety deposit box across town. He had learned long ago that criminals often destroyed evidence when they realized they were being investigated, and he wasn't about to let Kenneth have that opportunity. 6 months before the rat trap incident, when Kenneth's harassment had escalated from annoying to potentially dangerous, Daniel had installed a discreet security camera system around his property. These weren't the obvious dome cameras that homeowners bought at electronics stores, the kind that Kenneth might have noticed and avoided. Instead, Daniel used professional-grade wildlife cameras disguised as birdhouses and garden decorations, the same equipment he'd used in countless stakeouts during his career. He had positioned them strategically around the property, covering every angle of approach, each one motion-activated and capable of recording in high definition even in complete darkness. The cameras blended so perfectly with the natural environment that even the mail carrier walked past them daily without noticing. Those cameras had captured Kenneth's entire rat trap installation process in glorious high-definition video. The footage showed Kenneth arriving at Daniel's property just after dawn on a Tuesday morning, looking around nervously before stepping onto the lawn with a cardboard box under his arm. The video captured him walking deliberately toward the large oak tree where the flying squirrels were known to nest, pausing occasionally to glance back at the street. It showed him kneeling in the grass, carefully removing 3 heavy-duty rat traps from the box and positioning them near the base of the tree with the focused attention of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The cameras even caught the moment when Kenneth paused to photograph his handiwork with his phone, like a proud vandal admiring his destruction. Daniel had watched the footage 3 times, each viewing revealing new details, the premeditation in Kenneth's careful placement, the malice in his satisfied expression, the clear evidence of trespassing and intent to harm protected wildlife. But the cameras were just one layer of Daniel's preparation. 3 months before the trap incident, when Kenneth's harassment had escalated to almost daily violations, Daniel had reached out to his former colleague James Mitchell, who now worked as the regional director for the Federal Wildlife Services. James had been Daniel's partner during some of his most complex investigations, a man who understood the intricacies of wildlife law better than almost anyone in the country. Over coffee at a diner halfway between their two towns, Daniel had explained his situation, the HOA president who seemed obsessed with driving him from his home, the escalating fines and violations, the threats and intimidation. "I need to know how to properly document and protect the northern flying squirrel colony on my property," Daniel had said, stirring his coffee slowly. "If I can establish them as a protected habitat, I'll have federal law on my side." James had leaned back in his chair, a knowing smile crossing his face. "You're thinking like an investigator again." "Old habits," Daniel had replied, "but this guy doesn't know who he's dealing with." James had been more than helpful. Within 2 weeks, he'd sent a team to survey Daniel's property, 3 wildlife biologists who spent an entire day documenting the squirrel colony, counting individuals, photographing nesting sites, and assessing the health of the habitat. They had officially documented the colony as a protected habitat under federal jurisdiction, a designation that carried significant legal weight. James had then issued Daniel a formal habitat protection certificate, a document that required anyone attempting to disturb or remove the animals to obtain federal permits and follow strict protocols that were nearly impossible to satisfy. The certificate was printed on official government letterhead, signed by James and 2 other federal officials, and stamped with multiple seals that gave it undeniable authority. That certificate, which Daniel had never mentioned to Kenneth or the HOA, meant that Kenneth's rat traps weren't just cruel or unethical. They were a federal crime with mandatory minimum penalties that could include substantial fines and even prison time. Daniel had kept the certificate in his safe, waiting for the right moment to reveal its existence, knowing that timing was everything in building a case. Daniel had also been quietly gathering witness statements from other neighborhood residents who'd suffered under Kenneth's tyranny. He approached each conversation carefully, listening more than talking, allowing people to share their experiences without feeling pressured or manipulated. He was building a pattern of behavior case that would prove Kenneth's actions weren't an isolated mistake, but part of a systematic abuse of power, a campaign of harassment that had targeted multiple residents over several years. Old Mr. Henderson, who lived 3 houses down in a modest ranch home with a meticulously maintained garden, had been one of Daniel's first contacts. Henderson was 82 years old, a retired schoolteacher with kind eyes and gnarled hands that trembled slightly when he handed over a thick folder of documents. He had been fined $6,000 over 2 years for violations ranging from unapproved rosebush colors to excessive bird activity. Each violation letter was more absurd than the last, and Henderson had kept every single one, organizing them chronologically in plastic sleeves. "I thought about fighting him," Henderson had said, sitting in his living room surrounded by photographs of grandchildren. "But I'm too old for that kind of stress. My wife passed 2 years ago, and I just wanted peace." Daniel had felt a surge of anger on the old man's behalf, but he kept his voice calm and professional. "These letters document Kenneth's escalating demands and threats. They show a pattern that could be very useful." "You think you can stop him?" Henderson had asked, hope flickering in his tired eyes. "I know I can," Daniel had replied with quiet confidence. The Wilson brothers, twin accountants who lived on Maple Street in a contemporary home with solar panels on the roof, had provided even more damaging evidence. Richard and Robert Wilson were meticulous men in their early 40s, both wearing identical wire-rimmed glasses and speaking in the precise language of numbers and financial regulations. They had discovered something that went beyond harassment into criminal territory. Kenneth had been embezzling HOA funds to pay for his personal expenses. "We started noticing irregularities about 8 months ago," Richard had explained, spreading spreadsheets across Daniel's dining room table. "The numbers didn't add up. Expenditures were significantly higher than they should have been for an association of this size," Robert had continued, running his finger down a column of figures. "So we started digging." What they found was damning. Kenneth had been using the HOA's credit card to pay for country club memberships, luxury car payments, and even a 2-week vacation to Hawaii, all charged to the association and buried in vague budget line items labeled community improvements and administrative necessities. The brothers had documentation for everything: credit card statements, receipts, bank records showing transfers from the HOA account to Kenneth's personal accounts. The total embezzled over 3 years exceeded $40,000. "Why didn't you report this?" Daniel had asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. The brothers had exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Kenneth threatened us," Richard had admitted. "Said he'd use his HOA authority to make our lives miserable if we caused trouble. He knows we run our accounting business from home, and he threatened to cite us for operating a commercial enterprise in a residential zone." "We were afraid," Robert had added quietly. "But when you approached us with evidence of his other crimes, we realized we couldn't stay silent anymore." They had handed over their spreadsheets and financial records, evidence that would make any prosecutor's eyes light up with anticipation. Embezzlement combined with abuse of authority would add serious charges to whatever case Daniel was building. But Daniel's secret weapon wasn't just evidence, it was patience and strategic timing. Kenneth expected emotional reactions, angry confrontations, impulsive mistakes. That's how most people responded to bullies, and that's what Kenneth had encountered throughout his reign as HOA president. People got angry, said things they shouldn't, violated rules in retaliation, and Kenneth used those reactions to justify his continued harassment. But Daniel didn't react emotionally. Instead, he'd been building an airtight case with the methodical care of someone who'd put away career criminals, mob enforcers, and international trafficking rings. He had contacted the state attorney general's office, speaking directly with a prosecutor named Linda Chen, who specialized in white-collar crime and public corruption. He had reached out to the Federal Wildlife Protection Bureau, connecting with agents who took wildlife crimes as seriously as Daniel once had. He had filed reports with the county sheriff's department, documenting the trespassing and property crimes. He had even contacted the IRS Financial Crimes Division, knowing that tax evasion often accompanied embezzlement, and that the IRS had resources and determination that even the most arrogant criminals underestimated. To each agency, Daniel had provided carefully organized evidence packages that outlined Kenneth's various violations. Each package was professionally assembled, with table of contents, executive summaries, supporting documentation, and cross-referenced exhibits. He had included photographs, video footage, witness statements, financial records, and legal analyses. Everything was indexed and annotated, making it easy for busy prosecutors and agents to understand the scope of Kenneth's crimes. Daniel had learned long ago that investigators were more likely to pursue cases when the evidence was handed to them in a format that made their jobs easier. By the time Kenneth set those rat traps on Daniel's property, he wasn't just harassing a random neighbor who happened to love wildlife. He was walking into a trap of his own, surrounded by federal agents, state prosecutors, county investigators, and financial crime specialists who were just waiting for Daniel to give them the signal. The trap incident would be the final piece of evidence, the overt criminal act that would justify coordinating all the various investigations into one comprehensive prosecution. "Kenneth thinks he's hunting me," Daniel had told James Mitchell during one of their strategy sessions, meeting again at the same diner where they'd had their first conversation about the case. Outside the window, autumn leaves were falling from trees, covering the parking lot in shades of red and gold. Inside, Daniel's coffee had gone cold as he'd explained his comprehensive plan, laying out each element like chess pieces on a board. James had listened with the attention of someone who recognized genius when he saw it, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. When Daniel finished, James had smiled, the satisfied smile of a hunter who'd trained his apprentice well and now watched him execute a perfect strategy. "This is going to be beautiful to watch," James had said. Daniel had looked out the window at the falling leaves, thinking about Kenneth's arrogance, his certainty that he was untouchable, his complete blindness to the trap closing around him. He thought about Mr. Henderson's trembling hands, about the Wilson brothers' fear, about all the other residents who'd suffered in silence under Kenneth's tyranny. He thought about the flying squirrels nesting peacefully in his oak tree, innocent creatures that deserved protection from casual cruelty. "Kenneth thinks he's hunting me," Daniel had repeated, his voice quiet but filled with the cold determination of someone who'd spent 2 decades bringing criminals to justice. "But he doesn't realize he's the prey. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of hypocrisy, manipulation, and the satisfying consequences of deceit backfiring. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire accountability, fairness, and respect within communities."